HOA drama had never crossed Daniel Cross's mind when he built his quiet life by the shimmering blue lake that bordered his property. At 40 years old, Daniel had carved out a reputation as a steady, no-nonsense man who valued peace, privacy, and the beauty of the water that stretched across the horizon. He wasn't the kind to stir up gossip, and he wasn't one to bend rules either. What he did have, though, was something far more powerful than the nosy neighbors realized. He owned the entire lake. But that little detail didn't stop HOA Karen. She strutted into Daniel's life one summer morning with a clipboard under her arm and a scowl that could sour milk. Her complaint? Daniel's small fishing boat, tied neatly to his dock, was causing ripples that disturbed the view and, according to her, disrupted the peaceful aesthetic of the neighborhood. She declared that the HOA demanded he remove it immediately. Daniel had heard plenty of bizarre HOA rules in his time, but this was a new level of absurd. Yet behind his calm eyes was a man who knew how to fight battles, because Daniel wasn't just a homeowner. He had dealt with property disputes, written legal briefs, and now held the ultimate card, the lake. Every drop of it belonged to him. What Karen didn't know was that her demand would soon backfire spectacularly, and the HOA would be the one paying the price. Daniel Cross had lived by the lake for nearly 10 years, and in all that time, his life had been defined by calm routines. Early mornings fishing, long afternoons working remotely as a consultant, evenings spent walking the wooded trails with his golden retriever, Scout. He was 40 years old, with a weathered confidence that came from years of balancing professional discipline with the tranquility of lakeside living. To Daniel, this place wasn't just property, it was his sanctuary. That morning began like any other. The golden light of the sun scattered across the rippling water as Daniel sipped his coffee on the back deck. The boat, an old but sturdy fishing vessel with polished wood trim, rested quietly at the dock, swaying with the faint breeze. It was a familiar sight, part of the very fabric of Daniel's life. Yet within minutes, peace gave way to intrusion. Karen appeared. She didn't bother to call first. She didn't bother to knock. Instead, Daniel heard the sharp clack-clack of her low-heeled shoes on his gravel driveway, followed by the unmistakable bark of authority. "Mr. Cross, we need to talk about your boat." Daniel turned, mug in hand, and watched her march across his yard like she owned the place. Karen was in her mid-40s, her short blonde bob stiffly sprayed into place. She wore a floral blouse tucked tightly into high-waisted jeans, her HOA badge pinned proudly like a sheriff's star. Her expression was pinched, her eyes narrowed in judgment. "Good morning, Karen," Daniel said evenly, setting his mug down. "What's this about?" Karen whipped out a clipboard stacked with papers. "The HOA board has issued a formal notice. Your boat is causing ripples on the lake. It's disrupting the calm visual aesthetic we strive to maintain in this community. Therefore, you are required to remove it within 72 hours. Daniel blinked, momentarily unsure if she was joking. "Ripples?" he repeated. "Yes, ripples." Karen's lips tightened. "They travel across the water, disturb the reflection of the sky, and create what we consider a visual nuisance. Several neighbors have complained." Daniel nearly laughed. "Ripples? A lake without ripples wasn't a lake. It was a photograph." Still, he kept his composure. "Karen," he said, folding his arms, "this boat has been here for years. It hasn't harmed anyone, and more importantly, it's tied to my dock on my property." "That dock," Karen interrupted sharply, "extends into HOA-controlled waters. That makes the lake a shared community space. You can't just plop down whatever you want and ruin the serenity for everyone else." Daniel's jaw tightened, but he said nothing at first. He simply studied her, realizing with every second that Karen wasn't here to discuss. She was here to dictate. She wasn't a messenger of the HOA. She was its enforcer. Finally, Daniel said quietly, "Karen, you and your HOA may think you have control, but this lake doesn't belong to you. It belongs to me, every last square foot of it. Check the county records if you don't believe me." Karen let out a short, incredulous laugh. "That's ridiculous. Lakes aren't privately owned." "This one is," Daniel replied flatly. I bought it when I purchased this property. I pay the taxes. I manage the permits. If anyone is trespassing, it's your HOA. The smirk on Karen's face faltered for the first time, but she quickly recovered. Well, she said stiffly, scribbling on her clipboard, you'll be hearing from the board. Expect fines, and if you refuse to comply, we'll escalate. The HOA has ways of making things uncomfortable. She turned on her heel and stalked off, the gravel crunching underfoot. Daniel watched her go, his calm expression hiding the storm brewing beneath. He knew this was just the beginning. Karen and her HOA had picked the wrong man to bully. The next week brought no peace. What began with Karen's sharp words quickly turned into a campaign. Daniel noticed it in subtle shifts at first. His mailbox was suddenly stuffed with HOA notices, some official, others looking hastily typed. All of them carried the same refrain: remove the boat. Each letter was more absurd than the last. One accused him of disrupting the reflective symmetry of the lake's surface. Another claimed his boat caused migratory birds to alter their flight paths. The most ridiculous one insisted the boat posed a tripping hazard to children playing near the shoreline. Daniel had seen enough petty HOA nonsense before to recognize Karen's fingerprints. She wasn't just enforcing rules, she was manufacturing them. And behind her, the HOA board, half apathetic, half terrified of her, rubber-stamped her crusade. One afternoon, Daniel decided to confront the circus head-on. He walked into the HOA meeting, held in the community clubhouse, a sterile room lined with folding chairs and a podium that gave Karen a stage for her drama. As Daniel entered, he felt the room stiffen. A dozen neighbors sat awkwardly, whispering in low tones. At the front, Karen adjusted her floral blouse and gave him a smile that carried no warmth. "Mr. Cross," she said sweetly into the microphone, "how nice of you to join us. We were just discussing your little situation." Daniel sat in the back, arms crossed, letting her perform. Karen cleared her throat and began listing offenses the boat had supposedly caused: damage to property values, unsightly reflections, even stress for community residents. Each claim was met with scattered nods, though Daniel noticed the hesitation in many faces. They weren't convinced. They were cornered. When Karen finished, Daniel stood. His voice was calm but carried weight. "You're wasting everyone's time. The lake is mine. I own it, and your HOA has no jurisdiction over it. The boat stays." A few neighbors murmured in agreement, but Karen's eyes flashed. She leaned into the mic. "Ownership doesn't excuse disruption. This community thrives on order. If one person believes they're above the rules, chaos follows. That's why the board has voted to fine you. Starting immediately." Gasps rippled through the room. Karen smiled triumphantly, holding up a slip of paper. "Daily penalties until compliance. Consider this your first notice." Daniel stepped forward, his boots echoing on the tile floor. He stopped just short of the podium, his voice low and firm. "You're trespassing every time you step onto my dock or file papers about my lake. You're harassing me with baseless fines. If you don't back off, you'll face consequences far greater than ripples on the water." The room went silent. Karen's smirk wavered for the first time, but she clutched her clipboard like a shield. "You think threats scare us?" she snapped. "No," Daniel said evenly, meeting her glare. "But the law should." With that, he turned and walked out, leaving behind a room buzzing with whispered speculation. He could feel Karen's fury burning into his back, but he didn't need to look. He already knew she wouldn't stop here. Back at his cabin that night, Daniel stood on the deck, watching the moonlight dance across the rippling lake. Scout lay at his feet, ears perked as if sensing his owner's tension. Daniel's mind was clear. Karen wanted a war, and she had no idea he had weapons she couldn't even imagine. Legal, financial, and personal authority that went far beyond a neighborhood board. This wasn't just about a boat anymore. It was about power, and Daniel had more of it than Karen could possibly comprehend. The morning after the HOA meeting, Daniel awoke to the sound of Scout barking furiously. He stepped onto his porch to find a bright orange notice nailed to the wooden post by his driveway. The words "Final Warning" screamed in bold letters. Though he hadn't even received the first, he tore it down, scanning its absurd contents. The HOA demanded he remove his boat within 72 hours or face legal action. The notice concluded with a threat. Access to community amenities would be revoked if he failed to comply. Daniel chuckled darkly. Amenities? I have my own lake. But the paper wasn't the only sign of escalation. Later that afternoon, when he walked to the dock, he found Karen and 2 board members standing at the water's edge. Karen wore oversized sunglasses and held a clipboard like it was a weapon. "Mr. Cross," she called out, her tone dripping with condescension. "We've taken photos for documentation. Every day you refuse to comply increases your penalties. You'll regret this defiance." Daniel didn't dignify her with an answer. He simply turned his back and walked inside, Scout trotting beside him. Still, he could feel her glare burning holes into his shoulders. That night, Daniel noticed the first real crack in her campaign. While picking up groceries in town, a neighbor named James pulled him aside. A quiet man in his 50s, James looked nervous but resolute. "Daniel," he whispered, "you didn't hear this from me, but the board's divided. Karen pushes everything through by intimidation. Some of us never wanted to fine you in the first place." Daniel studied him. "Then why let her run it unchecked?" James sighed. "Fear. She controls through threats, lawsuits, shaming, even cutting people off from community events. Folks are tired, but no one wants to be her next target." Daniel placed a hand on the man's shoulder. "Thank you. That helps more than you realize." As Daniel drove back, the picture grew clearer. Karen wasn't as untouchable as she believed. Her power was smoke and mirrors built on fear, and fear could be dismantled. The next day, Karen struck again. Daniel returned from town to find his dock roped off with yellow caution tape, an official-looking unsafe structure sign hammered into the post. Neighbors gathered nearby, watching the scene unfold. Karen stood proudly at the edge of the dock, waving a printed ordinance. "For everyone's safety," she declared loudly, "this dock is condemned until removed." Daniel pushed past the tape with calm precision, tore the sign down, and threw it at her feet. His voice carried across the water. "This is my land, my dock, my lake. Step foot on it again without permission and you'll be trespassing." The crowd gasped. Karen's cheeks flushed red, but she forced a smile. "Oh, Mr. Cross, you'll soon learn this community doesn't bend for arrogance." Daniel leaned close enough for only her to hear. "Neither does the law." As he walked away, several neighbors who had once avoided eye contact now looked at him differently. Some nodded faintly, while others whispered amongst themselves. Karen noticed too. Her grip on the crowd wasn't as firm as it had been. Back inside his cabin, Daniel opened a locked drawer in his desk and pulled out a leather folder. Inside were deeds, water rights, and legal documents confirming his ownership of the entire lake. He had kept them private for years, but it was time to use them. Karen thought she was fighting a stubborn neighbor. She hadn't realized she was about to go up against the very man who controlled the water beneath her own reflection, and Daniel intended to make sure she and the entire HOA would never forget it. The days that followed were quiet on the surface, but Daniel knew Karen was plotting her next move. He kept his head down, spending mornings on his dock, sipping coffee while Scout lay at his feet. Yet beneath that calm exterior, he was meticulously preparing. One evening, as the sun dipped low across the shimmering lake, Daniel made a few calls. Old contacts from his law career, judges, clerks, even a retired state attorney, answered with enthusiasm when they heard his name. He didn't mention Karen or the HOA by name, only that a property rights issue had gotten out of hand. The wheels of justice, Daniel thought, needed only a gentle nudge. Meanwhile, Karen escalated her campaign of intimidation. Flyers appeared in mailboxes declaring Daniel non-compliant and a threat to community harmony. Children whispered about him at the park, repeating the venom their parents had heard at HOA meetings. Daniel noticed the subtle cold shoulders, the pointed glares, but he also noticed something else. Not everyone bought into Karen's narrative anymore. At the grocery store, an elderly couple smiled warmly and said, "We're rooting for you." A mother walking her toddler by the lake whispered, "Thank you for standing up to her, even James." The neighbor who had once spoken in hushed tones grew bolder. He stopped by Daniel's cabin one evening. "Karen's furious you tore down that caution sign," he said. "But people are starting to realize she's overstepping. Some of us, we're tired of being bullied." Daniel nodded. "Good, because the law is clear. And once I put the truth in front of everyone, there won't be anywhere for her to hide." The following week brought another spectacle. Daniel returned home to find a tow truck idling by his dock, chains rattling as two men prepared to latch onto his boat. At the helm stood Karen, smug and commanding, clipboard in hand. "This vessel," she announced to the small crowd of onlookers, "is hereby impounded for violation of HOA regulations. Mr. Cross has refused to comply with repeated orders." Daniel strode forward, every step radiating authority. "Unhook that truck," one of the workers hesitated. "We have orders from the HOA president." "You have no jurisdiction here," Daniel interrupted, voice sharp as steel. "This land, this dock, this lake, every inch is privately owned. Which means that if you so much as touch that boat, you're committing theft and trespass." Karen laughed. "Empty threats, Daniel. No one's afraid of your bluster." But then Daniel pulled out a leather-bound folder, holding it high for all to see. Not bluster, proof. He flipped it open, revealing official seals and signed deeds. "I own this lake outright. It is private property, registered and recognized by the state. Every ripple, every dock, every fish swimming beneath its surface belongs under my legal jurisdiction. And that means you—" He turned his gaze squarely on Karen. "Have been trespassing every time you set foot here." The workers stepped back immediately. One muttered, "We're not getting involved in this," before climbing into the truck and driving off. Karen's confident smile faltered for the first time. She tried to recover, barking at the neighbors. "Don't let him fool you! This is just another stunt." But murmurs rippled through the crowd. A man asked, "Is that true? Does he really own the lake?" A woman whispered, "If that's the case, then what else has she been lying about?" Daniel closed the folder, his eyes never leaving Karen's. "You've overstepped your authority, Karen, and I'll make sure every one of your fabricated fines and threats comes back to haunt you." That night, Karen paced her living room, seething. She had underestimated him. Daniel wasn't just another stubborn homeowner. He was a force she couldn't easily intimidate. And for the first time, the iron grip she held on the neighborhood was slipping. What Karen didn't realize was that Daniel hadn't even started fighting back. The real storm was yet to come. By the time the next HOA meeting rolled around, tension in the neighborhood was thick enough to choke on. What had once been uneventful gatherings had now turned into spectacles, with residents whispering about Daniel's stand against Karen. The meeting hall, normally half empty, was packed. Folding chairs lined the walls, and people clustered in the back, curious to see what would happen. Karen sat at the head table, arms crossed, her trademark smirk stretched thin. Beside her, two board members avoided eye contact, their discomfort visible. When Daniel entered, the room shifted. Conversations hushed. Some faces brightened, others tightened with unease. He walked calmly to the center, his leather folder tucked under his arm. Karen's voice cut through the silence. "Mr. Cross, your presence is unnecessary. This meeting concerns compliant members only." Daniel met her glare without flinching. "Correction. This meeting concerns every homeowner you've bullied into silence." "Which means it concerns me." Gasps echoed through the hall. Karen slammed her gavel. "Out of order!" "Security." "There is no security, Karen," one board member muttered under his breath. Daniel opened his folder, laying out documents on the table for all to see. "Here are the recorded deeds to the lake, dating back 50 years. My grandfather purchased it, and it has remained in my family since. Every legal document confirms what I've said. I own the lake." "Not the HOA!" Murmurs rippled through the crowd. Neighbors leaned in, pointing at seals, signatures, notarizations. The board members glanced nervously at each other. Karen's face flushed red. "He's twisting things," she snapped. "Ownership doesn't mean he can just ignore community standards." Daniel cut her off, his voice commanding. "Community standards do not override state law. Your rules stop at my property line. And every threat, every fine, every notice you've sent me is not only invalid, it's harassment." A man in the back spoke up, his voice trembling but strong. "She fined me $300 for planting the wrong flowers." Another added, "She banned my daughter from the pool for wearing a t-shirt." The room erupted in grievances. Years of pent-up frustration poured out, neighbors shouting over each other, listing fines, threats, and public humiliations. Karen banged the gavel furiously, but no one listened. Her authority, once absolute, was crumbling before her eyes. Daniel raised his voice just enough to be heard above the chaos. "You see, Karen, fear only works until people remember they have power." And tonight they remembered, the board members whispered hurriedly among themselves. Finally, one stood and spoke. "Effective immediately, I motion to suspend all fines and disciplinary actions against Mr. Cross, pending legal review." The other nodded quickly. "Seconded." Karen slammed the gavel again. "You can't." "I'm the president." "No," the first board member interrupted, voice firm. "You're just one vote. And I'm done letting you run this neighborhood into the ground." The hall erupted again, but this time the voices carried relief, even hope. Karen's face contorted in fury. She stood abruptly, her chair screeching against the floor. "This isn't over," she hissed at Daniel, loud enough for all to hear. "You've made an enemy you'll regret." Daniel gathered his documents, calm and deliberate. "No, Karen, you've made enemies of everyone here, and regret is coming for you." As he walked out of the hall, neighbors who once whispered behind his back now patted him on the shoulder, nodding with respect. Scout trotted proudly at his side, tail wagging as if sensing the tide had turned. Karen had ruled with fear for years. Tonight, Daniel had cracked her armor, and she knew it. Karen did not take humiliation lightly. For years, she had lived off the thrill of control, dictating how others decorated their porches, how often they mowed their lawns, even what colors their blinds could be. Losing that control in front of the entire community was more than she could stomach. 2 nights later, Daniel returned from the courthouse late in the evening. The sun had long dipped behind the trees, leaving the lake bathed in moonlight. Scout padded loyally at his side as he stepped onto the dock, breathing in the crisp night air. But something felt wrong. The silence wasn't the usual calm. It was sharp, expectant. Then he noticed the faint flicker of headlights bouncing through the trees. Multiple vehicles. Daniel's jaw tightened. He turned just in time to see 3 pickup trucks rolling down the private path that led to his property. Their engines growled like predators stalking prey. In the beds of the trucks, men in work gloves and hooded sweatshirts stood, holding equipment, chains, crowbars, and gasoline cans, and in the lead truck, sitting proudly in the passenger seat, was Karen. Her eyes locked on Daniel, lips curled into a smile so venomous it could curdle milk. The trucks skidded to a stop. Men jumped out, boots crunching gravel, faces masked with bandanas. One yanked open a gasoline can and splashed the liquid across Daniel's dock. Another hefted a crowbar and shouted, "We're taking care of your little boat problem once and for all." Scout barked fiercely, hackles raised, but Daniel motioned him to stay close. Karen stepped forward, her voice dripping with triumph. "You embarrassed me, Daniel Cross. You think you can outvote me? Outmaneuver me? You'll learn what happens when someone refuses the HOA. Tonight, this lake burns, and so does everything tied to it." Neighbors began peeking from porches, silhouettes forming against glowing windows. Whispers rippled through the night air. Some clutched phones nervously, but fear had always kept them from acting. But Daniel? Fear was not in his vocabulary. He took a step forward, shoulders squared, voice low and commanding. "Put the gas cans down, now!" One of the masked men laughed. "Or what? You gonna fine us?" Karen smirked, emboldened. "He's nothing but a loudmouth with a dock. He doesn't have the guts." That's when Daniel reached into his jacket and pulled out his leather badge case. He flipped it open, the metal glinting under the moonlight. The air shifted instantly. The boldness drained from Karen's face, replaced by a flicker of doubt. "I'm not just a homeowner," Daniel said, voice echoing with authority. "I'm Judge Daniel Cross, Federal District Court, and right now, you're trespassing on federally registered property. Every move you make is another federal crime." The crowd of neighbors that had gathered gasped. Cameras clicked, phones lifted, red recording lights glowing in the night. One of the men with the crowbar faltered, lowering it slightly. "Wait, judge? He's a judge?" Karen's voice shrilled. "Don't listen to him. He's bluffing!" But Daniel's eyes never wavered. His tone hardened, sharp as steel. "No bluff. And if you light one match, I will see you in federal prison so fast your grandchildren will be visiting through glass." Scout growled low, the perfect punctuation. The mob hesitated, confusion flickering among them. One by one, they backed away from the gasoline cans. The bravado drained. Only Karen stood her ground, trembling with rage. "You can't do this!" she screamed. "You can't ruin me!" Daniel stepped closer, his voice low enough that only she could hear, but cold enough to freeze her blood. "You ruined yourself the moment you thought you were untouchable." Blue and red lights suddenly flooded the trees. Sirens wailed. Sheriff's cars screeched to a stop at the edge of Daniel's property. Deputies stormed out, guns drawn. Karen's men scattered instantly, hands raised, some diving onto the ground. Karen herself froze, jaw quivering, as two deputies seized her by the arms. Daniel closed his badge and gave a single nod. "Book them all. Criminal trespass, conspiracy, attempted arson. And make sure Karen here gets her own cell. She's earned it." As Karen was dragged away, her voice cracked into hysterics, screaming curses that echoed across the water. Neighbors who had once feared her stood together now, some even clapping, others filming as proof. For the first time in years, the lake felt free, and Daniel Cross wasn't just a homeowner anymore. He was the line no one dared cross again. The following weeks were unlike anything the quiet lakeside community had ever witnessed. The HOA, once feared as an untouchable authority, now stood stripped and exposed under the harsh light of the law. Karen's arrest had been the beginning. What followed was a domino effect no one could stop. Daniel, though a federal judge, had taken care to let the legal system work its process. Still, his presence was enough to accelerate justice. At Karen's arraignment, the courtroom overflowed with neighbors eager to see the woman who had terrorized them for years finally face consequences. Karen sat in the defendant's chair, hands cuffed, hair unkempt, the smug composure that once defined her entirely gone. Her attorney made desperate motions to secure bail, but the judge presiding wasn't in the mood for leniency. With the charges stacked against her, criminal trespass, attempted arson, conspiracy, harassment. Karen wasn't going anywhere. Outside the courthouse, reporters swarmed, microphones flashing, cameras rolling. The headline blared across the county within hours. HOA president arrested after attempted arson of federal judge's property. Karen's name, once synonymous with control, now dripped with shame. But Daniel wasn't done. He knew that if the HOA was left standing, someone else might rise to take Karen's place. So he wielded his full authority. Using the legal framework of the HOA itself, along with documented complaints from neighbors who finally found the courage to speak up, Daniel issued a sweeping federal ruling. The HOA charter was dissolved. For the first time in decades, the lake community was free from its shackles. Neighbors gathered on Daniel's dock the night the news spread. Lanterns lit up the shoreline, laughter rippled across the water, and Scout lay happily by Daniel's chair, tail thumping as kids took turns petting him. An elderly couple toasted with plastic cups of lemonade. A young mother clutched Daniel's hand and whispered, "We didn't think anyone could stop her." "Thank you." Daniel smiled faintly, humbled but resolute. "You all stopped her. You just needed someone to show you the way." It wasn't long before Karen's house went on auction. The irony was not lost on the neighbors when the property, once the symbol of her dominance, was sold to a quiet family who planted wildflowers along the lawn. Her empire had crumbled into dust. Daniel, meanwhile, settled back into his peaceful life. He still sat on his bench overlooking the lake every morning, coffee steaming in his hand, Scout at his side. The ripples on the water carried no malice now, only calm. Sometimes he reflected on the bizarre events. He had come here for peace, yet he had found himself at the heart of war with a homeowners association that had forgotten its limits. And yet, in the end, justice had prevailed. Neighbors often asked if he would consider running a new board now that the HOA was gone. But Daniel always declined. He didn't come to rule. He came to live. His role was not to dominate, but to protect. One evening, as the sun sank behind the trees, painting the lake in gold and crimson, Daniel chuckled softly to himself. Karen had once mocked him for keeping his boat on the dock. She had claimed it was causing ripples that disturbed her perfect reflection. But now, the only ripples were those of freedom, spreading out across the lake, touching every shore. And Daniel Cross, the federal judge who owned the lake, had made certain they would never be disturbed again. If this HOA story shocked you, make sure to hit that like button, subscribe for more real HOA drama, and turn on the bell so you don't miss the next unbelievable showdown.